Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn Macdougall, and I'm one of the lead facilitators with the Tech We Want, which is a network of leaders collaboratively building infrastructure, tech products, and services that center human thriving in responsible innovation. We're here to co-create a shared narrative about what is the tech that we want to see in the world, and today we're going to discuss what it takes to bring up the next generation of leaders and ensure that they have an ethical lens as they're embarking in their work in responsible innovation. I have an incredible panel with me today of brilliant technologists, workers, leaders, visionaries, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation with them. But first, I would love everyone to introduce yourselves and to talk a little bit about who you are and locate yourself in relationship to this conversation that we're going to have about what it means to think about building up the next generation of talent for ethical tech, as well as what's your relationship to the project, The Tech We Want. And maybe I'll start over here with Coraline and we'll come around this way.
Sure. My name is Coraline Ada Emke. I'm the founder and executive director of the Organization for Ethical Source. I'm also very pleased to be in the Luminary program with the Tech We Want and also in the Builder program. I spend a lot of time mentoring early career folks, especially from marginalized backgrounds, and helping them wrestle with the exact problem that we're discussing today of how to center their ethics and center their sense of responsibility in the work that they do. So I am thrilled to be on the panel and to share some of the experiences that I've had with that.
My name is Jasmine Sun. I am the co-founder and director of Reboot, which is a publication and community reimagining techno-optimism for a better collective future. A lot of what animates Reboot's work is we're really a community and publication that is by and for early career and young technologists. So a lot of students, a lot of folks in their first few years out of college, people who are sort of mid-career transition and trying to figure out what does the next phase of my tech career look like. And in that vein, what we're really excited about is redefining what success and progress in technology can look like. So this mission of like, what does that next generation of tech leadership, of tech talent look like is a really important one, because I feel like when I look at the kinds of role models, the kinds of media that I was seeing about technology when I was in undergrad, when my co-founder and I had started Reboot, it only represented a very narrow array of voices, and it represented a narrow array of paths towards success, which was, like the $1 billion exit, the unicorn startup. And so what we're really excited about, what I'm personally really excited about, is making that a much more expansive and diverse vision of how technology can contribute to a more vibrant, more inclusive future for all of us.
Hi, my name is Ariam Mogos. I lead the emerging tech portfolio at the Stanford Design School. And really what that encompasses is designing classes for undergraduate and graduate students at the intersection of equitable design or design justice and emerging technologies like AI, the Internet of Things, gene editing, and also creating learning resources for K-12 learners and educators and the public. And I came into this amazing community just by following a bunch of the luminaries, learning about the work, and I think for the D School, it's really important for us to be in broader community with others who are so values aligned, and to have examples for students of people in the world who are doing really important work at those intersections, specifically of design justice and emerging technologies, so that they can see alternatives to what they currently see in the tech sector. So it's really been a wonderful experience and opportunity to work with this community to think through that.
Thanks, Ariam.
My name is Marco Rogers. I'm a software engineer, and I've been doing that for 20 plus years. For the last 10 years or so, I have been very deep in tech startup culture, working at various venture-backed startups in industries from healthcare to news media, and more so as a manager and leader. So I've been a person who builds teams, hires new engineers, tries to sort of grow them and help them navigate this industry, and running into a lot of the challenges with making it an equitable and diverse sort of workplace, and engaging with what it means to try to build responsible tech and teach engineers to build responsible tech. My relationship with the project, The Tech We Want, is much more personal. So my wife, Anita Williams, is actually the leader of the project, and I like to think that maybe I had some hand in her sort of developing the ideas around it just from complaining a lot about my job and wanting to see things be better.
Hi everyone, my name is Julia Solano. I am community architect for the Tech We Want, which means I lead a lot of the work on information and knowledge management. Previously, I co-founded a humanitarian AI company and have worked in tech in various capacities as a designer, as a marketer, and previously went to UC Berkeley and was really involved in the maker movement there. I studied engineering and architecture and saw firsthand that a lot of what I learned there wasn't really grounded in ethics. And there was so much that I learned and discovered after working in the humanitarian aid space and after co-founding a tech company as a woman of color.
All right, we have such an incredible group of people here. We have people who are working, who have been at the beginning of the project, people who are working closely inside the project now. We have followers and fans of the project. We have technologists, we have educators, we have people who've been through education, who work in education. This is going to be an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for trusting us and coming here and being together. All right, let's get into it. Ooh, here we go. How would you describe the state of leadership in the tech industry right now? Do we have leaders? Do we have the leaders we need to create a responsible, inclusive, and equitable tech-fueled future? How would you describe the state of leadership? Who wants to give it a go? Marco, I don't know. I'm just having a sense. I want to come to you first.
I think it's a great question. The first thing that I would do is sort of identify different leadership roles. If you're talking about the people who run these companies, I think there's a lot to be desired, right? But when I think about leadership and technology, I want us to be talking about the technologists themselves, the people who conceive of this tech and the people who build it, because I think that we should have more say in how these things develop. And that's where I see a lot of the tensions, right? We have to contend with the executives and people who sort of own these companies for how the technology actually manifests. And I experience that tension every day, right? So I guess a more direct answer to your question is that I think we have lots of people who are vying for leadership. And the unfortunate thing is some of them have a lot of power and many billions of dollars, right? And so that's a challenge. And we need to grow in some very significant ways. But there are people who do great work and who really want to see things be better, to serve more people, to have technology be a force that really lifts people up. And I work with those people all the time. So.
Thanks, Marco. Coraline, I want to come to you as someone else who's been working in the industry for many years. And also you were talking about how you've spent a lot of time mentoring new and emerging leaders. Through that experience, how do you feel about the state of leadership in the industry?
I've said before that I think one of the problems plaguing us as an industry is this cult of personality, this idea that a single leader can do everything, knows everything, is completely capable of understanding any situation. And especially when we're talking about something like ethics and values, if you don't want them to simply be like what's painted on the hall on the way to the bathroom, it has to be ground up. It has to start at the level of our teams, of the new people that we're bringing in. These are cultural values. If they're not expressed, if they're not lived, then they are simply the writing on the wall on the way to the bathroom. So I think really much more of a ground up approach. Identifying leaders among the people who are rising is super important, and then connecting them in a meaningful way with people who are more senior, I think, is also really important, whether that be in a mentoring relationship or some other kind of relationship. We have to work together on these things, and we can't rely on a single person to be the leader who takes us through this often very confusing and very contradictory set of decisions that we have to make as teams and as an industry.
So I'm hearing you talk about the intergenerational value of working together to enable leaders to emerge. I'd love to hear from you, Jasmine, given that you are a leader of emerging leaders in many ways. I'd love to hear sort of your perspective, given your sort of closeness to academia and to folks who are just exiting academia, and what you're seeing both in the people that you are working with and how they understand the leaders that they are looking up to.
For sure. So For context, so when I was in undergrad, that was when I started Reboot. I did undergrad at Stanford, which is very entwined with Silicon Valley and that entire tech ecosystem. I really like what Marco said about there's different classes of leaders. There's the people who are sort of the figureheads of the companies, maybe the CEOs, the owners, or the venture capitalists, or whoever, are often the most visible. And then there are all of these other leaders, whether inside or outside of industry, who may not have as visible roles, but may actually be the ones driving the vision or building the technology. I think the unfortunate thing is, to your point, Jocelyn, is that these very visible figureheads, these CEOs and the people writing the tweets and the blog posts and things like that, that is where a lot of folks look when you are in college and you're a computer science major and you're like, who do I look to know where the industry is headed? Who is my role model? How do I want to behave myself? What kinds of, like people really model their behavior after these public figures. And so I think tragically, even though the real leaders may not only be these like loudmouth CEOs, honestly, sometimes the loudmouth CEOs are going to be the ones who shape what students in their early career are looking towards. And I think I've seen in the past few years, like as I think the more nationalist side, the more right-wing nationalist side of technology, sort of headed by figures like Peter Thiel, has become more prominent as political advocates, as donors, as lobbyists. Like I can see that shaping the way that students at Stanford think about what their values are and who they want to model. And it's like these shifts happen very rapidly. It's just like you're 20 years old. This is a very critical time in your life. And I think that's why it's so urgent and so important to have platforms for a wider array of leaders to be featured and to shape those dreams of that next generation.
Thanks, Jasmine. Julia, I want to come to you next because you've certainly worked in the industry as well, but I've been in conversation with you directly about this idea of when you were in school, what you understood success to look like and what a leader was, and then some of the experiences that you've had coming out and since being in school, and then returning back and saying, whoa, like, I see that that's still alive and well amongst some of your peers from your alma mater, but you having developed a very different kind of perspective. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as many folks have said already, there are some set paths or pathways to success of like what it means to be a good entrepreneur, what it means to be a successful technologist. And often that means having $1 billion exit. That means like having a lot of clout, creating something that's really scalable, creating something that's really flashy for a specific audience. And in a lot of the work that I've done, I've seen that so often those technologies center a very specific group of people. It's designed by a very specific small set of people. And when I was doing humanitarian aid work in Jordan and in Greece, I saw like moms who were stay-at-home moms still using Facebook Marketplace, still using these functions, knowing that they were never the audience that it was designed for. And coming back into spaces that I used to be in, and I ended up leaving my startup in the past due to various reasons, some of which being personal burnout, being really loving the work that I was doing, but also spreading myself too thin and existing in that culture of continually working 80-hour weeks, getting really anxious, continually trying to push myself to optimize, to think faster, to be better, and pushing myself to a breaking point in some ways, and taking some time away from that world, healing, looking into other aspects of myself, going back into architecture. I had a stint bamboo building for some time, and then coming back into the technology world and talking to younger students and realizing to them, for them, my story was still a success story. That even though I didn't exit a company the same way so many other people did, that is still something meaningful. And that made me realize that I didn't see leaders like me in university. And it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Like there are so many people, especially women, especially diverse leaders who are doing things that don't fit within a traditional framework or box, who aren't standing on stages, giving big talks, but are leading in very meaningful and personal and community-oriented ways.
Beautiful. That feels really related to what we just heard from Jasmine of like, we need to see different kinds of leaders so that the young emerging like students and emerging leaders have something to model themselves after that's different from the Peter Thiels and others. I want to come over to you, Ariam, because of course you're working with students all the time. And even right before this panel, we were chatting a little bit about what it's like when students come into the classroom and they have one very sort of narrow vision of what it means to have success, what it means to become a leader in the field. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see them coming in with, what you see in the industry with respect to leadership, but also what might be possible through their experience in your course, for example.
Sure. So I think I've experienced students coming into class with feeling actually a lot of pressure to build something successful, especially when they're coming from CS, computer science, or HCI, human-computer interaction, and sort of related like technology sort of majors. What I've experienced is there are students who, I teach a class called Tinkering with Inequity and Emerging Tech in the winter quarter, and there are students who are drawn to the class because they want to they want to build thoughtful products or services, but they don't necessarily understand how to do that in practice. There's a huge gap. And really where I like to situate them is thinking about and learning about sort of just how society is structured. So one thing I'll say about more generally about CS education, for example, it's not very interdisciplinary. And that's why we see designers in the world, technologists, amplifying or recreating social, structural inequities in the world. And so it's really important for students, even if they're in CS, to sort of be reading sociology books, reading anthropology books, bringing in this sort of interdisciplinary lens, because that helps students understand, if I'm going to, join a startup that's building a housing app, but I don't know anything about redlining, and that the data that might be used is sort of embedded with all this bias, then they're going off and creating applications that just recreate and amplify those structural inequities. So in this course, for example, I have them reading everything from Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks to Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. So it's really important that students understand that they have to be social scientists. That's what I tell them. You can be a technologist, but you also have to be a social scientist, because if you don't really understand the root causes of the problems in our society, you're actually going to make them much worse if you try to build tech on top of them.
I have seen that happen so many times repeatedly. And I love what you said about like, you have to also be a social scientist. I think at least when I was coming up as an engineer, and I think this is true in many ways still, we were basically told that we were the smartest people in the room and that any problem could be solved by sitting down and thinking about it really hard. Ignoring the wealth of human knowledge accumulated over thousands of years in terms of the way people interact with each other, the way people interact with society, and understanding that these systems are technosocial systems. So I really applaud the work that you're doing at a university level to impart that kind of wisdom on new folks who are entering the field.
Yeah, if I could,
Please, no, get right into it.
Okay, yeah, I'm like so glad we're having this conversation. I think one other thing, because when I was in school, I also TA'd for a couple different sort of public interest tech or tech and ethics type courses, our computer science department. And I think one thing that's really interesting is when people first start thinking about how do we introduce a more interdisciplinary lens into CS or things like that, sometimes your first instinct is maybe we should just like have them all read Kant or something, and this is like seriously what I think a lot of folks start with, because that's the first inclination. And I think it's not saying that you shouldn't read Kant. I think actually getting grounding in different models of ethics and philosophy, and beyond philosophy, of course, disciplines like sociology, political science, etc., is very useful. But one thing that I always notice being a gap from the vast majority of my college education, as well as the education of a lot of young technologists who I speak with, is you actually going from theory to practice and understanding what it means to be a practitioner and to have a theory of change. What I often feel like is folks in technical disciplines like engineering are sometimes given the tools to do things and make things in the world, but not a sense of like what they ought to be making or where they should apply leverage. And then folks in other disciplines, I studied sociology actually, even though I work in tech now, we are given a bunch of theories and frameworks for thinking about the world, but not that many tools to build things and do something about it, which is, I think, why this collaboration is so necessary. And then you layer on the sort of complexity of when you're a tech worker in an organization. Like, I have a day job. I work as a product manager at a startup. And when you actually, there's another layer of education that's not only like, okay, in the ideal world, how would you build the thing you want? But given that you occupy this position in this institution, and you probably can't do whatever you want in that institution, you have a lot of people to collaborate with, to negotiate with. And how can you, from within that context, sort of, whether it's advocating for more accessibility features in a tech product you are building, or maybe unionizing your workplace, or contributing to efforts like that, or advocating for encryption or more transparency. I think like it would be amazing on top of this sort of base knowledge for more communities and institutions, when they think about ethical tech education, to not only think about the ideal, but like actually as a theory of change, how do we help these young people who are working in industry, who are building things, advocate from within the context that they're situated in?
And I'll just add to that, I think another thing that I've seen with students, and one thing we've really tried to incorporate in our work, is how do we help students identify the value system that aligns to who they are? Because I think another thing we've seen is, again, there's not a lot of intentional design or thoughtful design. And we put ourselves in the things that we create and design, right? Our biases, our perspectives, our values. We have to be very conscious of that. So with students, how do we at the very beginning name our positionality in the world, understand what perspectives and biases we may bring to the table in what we design, and then how do we support students to sort of identify that value system that helps lead them into decision making when they join a startup. Is this values aligned? Is this what I want to be building, right? So if I believe that the internet should be a public good, am I going to engage in building a tiered internet? So I think that's really important for students to lead with their values, understand how to do that so that they can make those decisions in an ethical way for themselves.
So this brings us to our next question. Perfect segue, thank you so much. But I feel like we're heading in this direction. So what I'm hearing is, yes, there's some real troubles with like a lot of the visible leadership that we see inside of the tech industry. However, there are many leaders in the industry who are also doing really great work. They're just maybe not as visible. And also, we've got all these young folks coming up who are emerging leaders who actually want to be doing things ethically, who are interested in values-driven work, but who may not actually totally know. And then there's some questions about how the education system is or is not equipping them with the analysis as well as the tools to be able to do that work together. But what I'm hearing as we're starting to go down this pathway towards this conversation about values, I've got a question here which I think is an interesting proposition, an interesting thing for us to consider, which I'd like us to do together here, which is there a role for universal principles or a code of ethics to play in tech? Some kind of universal code of ethics to play in tech? And if yes, in one way or another, what would it take for a critical mass to adopt this?
I'd like to jump in.
I'd love for you to jump right on in.
So, the short version is yes, there is a role, and I think it's actually really critical. My experience, like I said, I started like 20 years ago, and the landscape was very different. We didn't really get any kind of training, to be honest.
In what kind of, when you say we didn't get training of what
meaning,
type?
So in particular, about the implications of what we were building.
Aha.
Right? And my experience, when I say there's a very different landscape, I think it's important to contextualize. My experience is we had a lot of room to mess it up really bad, then learn from that, and then fix it, right? And it's important to sort of
And
help
was that
people.
true? Can I just like question into that? Was that we had room to mess it up really bad from a technical perspective, like make a bunch of mistakes technically and then fix the bugs? Or was it also mess it up really bad, like make a terrible product that did terrible things in the world and then fix that?
Yes, and.
Both and, okay.
Yes, and. Definitely from a technical perspective, like we had to do things that hadn't been done. Like, and it's a great feeling to feel like you are, on the cutting edge of something, right? I worked for a contracting company, but we did a lot of work for AOL in the 2000s, right? And really sort of shaping what the open web was going to be. Like I was sort of working at AOL when they went from this very closed internet experience to trying to be more open, and got to sort of see a lot of those conversations unfold. I was young, so I didn't really understand a lot of the implications, but I got to sort of participate. But not just from a technology perspective. I mean, AOL is a good example because they were sort of the massive scale player at that time, before a Facebook and a Google and everything else. And so, there's this dynamic at AOL where, when you pull up the AOL web browser, people may not know this, AOL had their own web browser, but you get this welcome page, right? And AOL at that time is the entire internet, like millions and millions of people. And so whatever they put on that welcome page will instantly get all of the traffic, right? And it was a very, very important conversation within AOL. What is going on the welcome page today? It was very political, a lot of jockeying for position, but also a lot of impact. Like whatever link is on that welcome page is a tacit endorsement. Like I watched that conversation develop. Like whatever we put on the welcome page, people are gonna think that's what you should look at on the internet. This is the most important thing on the internet, right? And we were very unprepared for those kinds of conversations at that time. And so we did that a lot. We did a lot of things that AOL, like as a company, would regret, like putting things, like driving traffic to a lot of things and finding out actually that was not great. We should not have done that. But there was, it was a new space, so there was room to sort of backtrack. There was room to sort of apologize. And what's changed is that we're very far past that. Like, if you make a mistake, it's all over the news instantly, right? It has a real impact on your company, which is going to have real impact on sort of you and your career. And the important thing to sort of understand is we're still, in many cases, talking about young people who are still very new in their careers, right? Like there's a direct connection. Like I wrote some code, I pushed it out, like 10 million people saw it, and now everybody's really upset. You know what I mean? And there are, mechanisms within companies to sort of shield people from that, but it's not perfect. And these young sort of technologists are feeling the real impact of the things that they're actually building, and it's super tough. So going back to your question, right? We sort of went around to sort of come back to this idea of a code of ethics. I think it's about really giving people the tools to understand how can I as a technologist make decisions that I won't come to regret, that I can stand behind what I built and say that I had some thoughtfulness behind it, and that I didn't, at least knowingly or intentionally, or put something out into the world that ended up being harmful. Like we have to give people tools to reason about that, because like in the absence of that, they're going to find out the really hard way.
Aryam, I feel like this is exactly what you were talking about, is enabling students to feel like they understand how to start from a place of their own value set and then build technology that they can ultimately, what I'm hearing you say, Marco, is at the end of the day, it's that we want to equip people with the ability to be able to stand behind whatever they produce, whatever they write, whatever they push out there, that they know that no matter what happens, they feel aligned with the thing that like gets birthed into the world. And I'm wondering, how do we adopt such a thing? Like, I think there's an obvious, argument to be made that we can bring it in an educational space, but I'm interested in how we bring that into the conversation in the industry, right? Because we can equip the young ones with that kind of, those kinds of tools, but if they are not enabled, if they are not invited to utilize those tools in their jobs as they are negotiating with the leaders that they are being hired by, et cetera, then, it's just more of the same. So I'm curious about how we think about what it would take to entertain an idea of some kind of universal principles throughout the industry, and what it would take to get those kind of approved or agreed upon by a significant critical mass.
Something I want to touch on in the context of that question is we're putting a lot of pressure in this conversation on young people who are coming out of college.
Agreed.
And let's not forget the autodidacts who are teaching themselves and getting into this field. I think this is something I tell early stage career folks all the time. You will have to compromise at the beginning of your career because you do not have the leverage and you do not have the mobility necessarily to pick a company that is 100% in line with your values. So you may have to do your stint, and Marco and I were talking about this earlier. We've had jobs that we regret working at, but they got us to where we are now. So sometimes there is there's a moral calculus that you have to do. But to the point of like a general code of ethics, we like to call ourselves software engineers. We're not engineers for the most part. Engineering fields have codes of ethics that you have to maintain, or you lose your license.
Okay.
There is precedent for this in other industries. There's the whole apprenticeship model that many industries follow. There are ways to do this, but capitalism doesn't incentivize these ways of doing things.
Okay, and this is, I think, we're really getting down to it, right? Is that it is possible, and there are models in other kinds of professions of having like codes of ethics that you have to stand behind, or else you lose your job, you lose your profession. But what is it about, like, what would it take inside of capitalism to do this inside of tech?
One of the things, I've thought about this a lot, and I've actually tried to educate myself about how this sort of like real engineering certification works in other industries. I think it's a little bit far afield for me, but it's been really interesting. I think one of the big things that comes with it is an accountability, right? When you call yourself a civil engineer, a mechanical engineer, if you build a building, if you build a roller coaster, and that thing has problems, you are not only responsible, you are liable. Like, you are the person that they are going to call. You're the person that's going to be in trouble. And, I think for better or worse, software is different in some very significant ways. One is that when things go wrong, it definitely has an impact, but it's not the sort of like tangible physical impact of like
the bridge has fallen
building.
down.
It's falling,
Yeah.
right? So people sort of engage with it a little bit differently. And in fact, part of the conversation we have been having is, impact that happens to people in these digital online spaces is real impact, right? At first, we didn't even really talk about it like that, but now we have to, right, with Instagram and everything else. So, I think it's talking about sort of that liability, but I think the other thing that makes it significantly different in my mind is software is much more malleable, right? If I make a mistake today, I can fix it and it can be fixed tomorrow, And so we are able to sort of iterate and learn at a much faster pace, and we sort of have to engage with that. And so I think that sort of changes the tone of what we talk about when we talk about accountability for technologists. I would like to think it gives us more room to sort of, be responsible, to really push the bounds of what we want to achieve, but to mess up sometimes in a way that is fixable, so that we learn, so that we can sort of continue to move forward. I would like to think that's what would sort of be different about it, right? I paint that picture in order to sort of come back around to this idea of a professional organization with a code of ethics, and with this idea that we're not just building whatever we get paid to build, but we have values that we put into whatever we build, and you can't hire us unless you sort of buy into that, right? One of the biggest things that I think is a challenge for people coming into this industry is when they get to say no. Realistically, technologists have a lot of ability to push back,
right?
To say maybe not, or to redirect. but it's actually really difficult to understand how to do that effectively.
And I
it's
think
really
this is-
difficult to understand when it's going to impact your career and your job.
This is
right?
what exactly we were talking about, is that like people don't have the skills. You were talking about this, Jasmine. People aren't equipped with how do we do this? How do we push back? How do we negotiate? And when we're talking about this sort of universal sense of ethics, I can imagine this sort of parallels to, an architecture and engineering, a law, et cetera. But I'm also thinking about, in this conversation, some of the structural inequalities that you're talking about that get baked in, and how do we elevate into that sort of professional ethics some conversations and some understanding around those structural inequalities as well?
Yeah, I think ethics is challenging because we can design a universal sort of framework around ethics, but what does that mean in practice? So like one thing that we try to support students with is how do you prototype with implications before you put something into the world, right? That does a lot of harm. So how do we incorporate prototyping and iterating and understanding, in early stages, I'm designing something, what are the implications on different communities, especially those who have been historically oppressed or marginalized, for example, right? How do we always put that at the forefront when we're designing something at an early stage, understanding the implications and iterating on that before we put something into the world? Because I think a code of ethics is really important, and I don't know if it's not equivalent to harm necessarily that's going to be created, and I think that's what really has to be prioritized, right? We have to ensure that not only are we not harming certain communities that have historically been harmed over and over again, but how do we make sure that they are at the center of this conversation and thriving? And I think a code of ethics, like at Stanford, I think in a lot of the CS and HCI classes, students do go through ethical frameworks, but that again doesn't necessarily help them think through the actual tangible harms that are caused to certain groups of people.
So what I'm hearing is that one of the ways that we go around this, or that we help our young emerging leaders figure it out, is to like think it all the way through.
Yes.
Practice thinking it all the way through to like,
Exactly.
what are all the possible consequences
Yes.
of the thing that you're putting out into
That's
the world,
right.
allowing them to have space, allowing them to
Yes.
get practice. What are the questions we have to ask
Yes.
ourselves in order to imagine what those end results could potentially be? Jasmine, I'm really interested to come over to you and talk about, in the communities of young people that you are part of, what are some other ways that you are working with one another to, here's the thing. I'm telling myself a story that if you've got all of these young folks together who are interested in being ethical technologists, in doing responsible innovation, and are collectively sharing with one another these stories of challenges of how do we put it into practice, how do we negotiate it in the workplace, how do we do these things. The story I'm telling myself is that in sharing those experiences with each other, maybe you're sharing and coming up with some additional kinds of solutions, some experiments that you're working on or that you've tried out together or individually. And I just wonder if you could share, if one, is that true? And two, if yes, could you share some of that?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think a lot of the motive behind Reboot is the idea that institutions can go a long way, universities, classrooms, your workplace training, and that's all very important. But on top of that, you want these communities where people are talking about their values, their work, their purpose, and it's all kind of interwoven. And it's actually as much of a peer community
Yes.
as it is like the professor is going to tell me to do it this way. Because that can only go so far, is like your professor or your boss or whoever telling you, like, please like fill out this rubric before you like start your project, like that's helpful. But I think fundamentally for people to really buy into it, it's about the people and the mentors you surround yourself with. And so something that I tell a lot of young folks who I mentor, who I meet through Reboot, is to make sure that you have a circle, whether it's Reboot or somewhere else, where you have peers who are working through the same questions together with you.
Yes.
You can trade ideas about hard things like, oh, like I'm working on this project and I don't feel great about it. And I don't know if I am in the position where I can speak up. And like, if you have folks who are even a few years older, a little bit more experience than you, and you can have that very candid conversation about like, how do I write this email? Or like, do you think it makes sense to bring up? Or how do you navigate that situation? Like, I think it is actually very rarely as clear cut as a yes, no code of ethics, like check the box or not, which is why I feel like having these persistent, like lifelong, years long, not just college, not just a single quarter, not just a single company groups of people who you can negotiate these questions with is so important.
So this idea of like walking beside our
Yeah.
peers as we collectively navigate this complicated territory feels like a really important way that, you know, emerging leaders, but I have to imagine also established leaders who are involved in mentorship type relationships are also like having their eyes open to, oh my gosh, I never navigated that. Oh, that's something I really need to also consider, et cetera. Okay, so this is very interesting. Julia, I want to come over to you and just, I'd love to get your sort of thoughts here about how you have understood like navigating this question of ethics and as you sort of left the tech sector and then came back to it, what are some of the learnings that brought you back?
I really agree with some of what Jasmine was saying with like, it depends on who you surround yourself with, the ideas and the influences that you have. I think back to the groups of friends that I've had over the years and reflecting on like, oh, it's amazing to be surrounded by anthropologists or by, I mean, my background's in engineering and architecture, but I intentionally tried to create a very interdisciplinary method, and that was a challenge at the time. I remember speaking to various college counselors while I was in school, and my architecture professors were like, why aren't you just an architect? And all of my engineering, like mechie, industrial engineering professors are like, why are you even studying architecture? Just be an engineer. And realizing at that point, if I want to build things for people, it requires both of these sides. And both of these people, like there's a cliche that they speak different languages.
Sure.
And what would it mean to know both of those languages and be able to bridge them so that I can build things ultimately for people? But yeah, I think that has been really foundational for me in being able to see my own blind spots. I had lots of friends who were activists or involved in social sciences or deeply studying things that I was not deep in. And it's so easy to get lost in our own circles and our own biases and our own industries, and having friends that are like who I trust enough and who trust me enough to be honest about the times that I am unintentionally capitalist with my biases or unintentionally doing something that may perpetuate harm in the future has been really, really helpful. And I think having those kinds of connections and being willing to be humble and learn from those who have like immersed themselves in other ways of thinking and being has been really, really foundational.
So I'd love to move us into a bit of where I feel like the conversation is going, which is around, you know, we know that we need to have different kinds of leaders. We know that we need to be in community as we're learning. We know that we need to be able to spiral things all the way out to the possible impact. And I think within the project, The Tech We Want, one of the hypotheses that we are built, like that our whole project is built on, is that one of the ways that we do all of those things is by centering the margins, is by bringing in thinkers, leaders, technologists, makers, visionaries to drive us forward who have historically come from communities, backgrounds, et cetera, that have not been the visible loudmouth CEOs, right? Who have not been the leaders that people at university are listening to, you know, come back and speak to their alma mater or whatever else. So I want us to sort of close here in the next few minutes around a conversation about what does it mean to center the margins? What does it look like in tech culture? And particularly, so what does it mean? I'd love to hear from those who have worked directly on The Tech We Want. What has been your experience about how we're doing that here? But also for folks who are working in industry or have experience in industry, what does it mean to try to do that inside of organizations that are still very hierarchical? So I think we have this sort of, I mean, for lack of a better word, I think we have a bit of an inside and outside question. So maybe we'll start with the outside question. What does it mean to try to center the margins in organizations that are still very hierarchical? And then we can move into the like, what have we been trying to do inside of The Tech We Want to try to displace some of those hierarchies? Think of the outside game. Anybody want to take it?
I always
Like,
have
is it
words.
possible? Is it possible? Maybe we start there. Is it possible to center the margins in organizations that are very hierarchical?
I think it's a really interesting question. It kind of touches on something that you said earlier as well, about not only asking ourselves, like, will this technology that we're developing cause harm, but rather, am I the right person to answer that question? So if we do not have people in decision-making capacities who have the lived experience of oppression and marginalization as a result of these systems. Even the best intentioned people are going to build things that cause real harm. And I think in particular about like disability tech, accessibility tech, these are things that we like to bolt on at the end of a process rather than building them in from the beginning. And everyone benefits from accessibility. Everyone eventually is going to have a disability. So disability tech, investing in that in a significant way is really, really important. And when we do those things, it requires a little bit more of a long-term vision. But when we do those things, when we elevate the margins, that doesn't like just flip the disparity. It actually flattens the curve for everyone. And I think that's what we should really be focused on, even in our hierarchical organizations.
Thanks, Coraline. I'd love to see what your thoughts are, Aryam, around like even from your vantage point within the university. Do you see this as a possibility? Do you see it happening? And if so, how does it happen?
I think to Coraline's point, I think in industry, there have to be more people who are in, especially like in management positions, in the executive suite, like who have real decision-making power, and who have the lived experience of those who have been historically oppressed. I think that's really important, because I think if you don't understand the problems and then you don't have actually have the agency to address them, then I think it's really, really difficult. And the way the demographics of the tech industry now, I mean, we're nowhere near that, unfortunately. So I think that just really has to shift.
Marco, you were talking earlier about how much of your career in tech has been in a management role. So, arguably as a Black man, you are coming from a community that has been historically marginalized inside of tech and other spaces in the great US of A. And I'm curious about what that has looked like in your own experience. Are you experiencing a centering of the margins inside of hierarchical tech? Is that shifting? What has your experience been like?
It's tough, right? Let me be real, right? Like, in my experience, there is a really big shift happening inside of these companies. It's not always visible to people on the outside, but it is a mess, right? Like, it's a mess. We have gone through a really long period of starting to engage with the ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion. We created a lot of levers to really push these companies to diversify. And as a result, we brought in all these new people from different backgrounds. And then there was like very little guidance about what happens after that.
Right.
And what I have experienced is, these different cultures and backgrounds and expectations and different needs just really crashing into each other. The people at the top are still very like homogenous. Right. And what it looks like in practice is them getting so much input. Like even if you imagine the most progressive white male, like straight white male who really wants to hear it, it's a lot for them and they don't have the tools, right? And a lot of times they're going to fail at it. And then you sort of have the flip side of that, which is when, people are trying to stretch themselves and they inevitably fail, what happens? What happens? And it causes a lot of drama. And, inside of these organizations, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of, angst and hurt feelings at the same time that we're trying to get work done, at the same time that everybody has to try to do their job and, do well enough to keep their job, And so I do think that things are it's pretty tough. Like you sort of, I think, asked the question, is it possible in these very hierarchical organizations? We do have to sort of pull in the other direction, but it can't be sort of anarchy as well. Someone has to be in charge. I think, and I'd like to hear from some other folks on this, but I've seen equally as much drama and angst when we really try to give all of this sort of power to young people who are not ready to wield it, right? Equally as much. And so there has to be some sort of balance. And I think my best, I think my best idea today is we do have to create a class of leaders who are really able to take in so many different perspectives, try to really synthesize them into something that makes sense, and then like get feedback about whether they succeeded or did not. And I think that's also really tough to do. Like as a leader, as a manager, the real pressure that's on you is to always sound like you know what to do. That is what people actually want from you, is to have answers, right? And that is just that's not the same thing as I need to hear what people think. I need to process. I need to get feedback. It may take a while. I don't have an answer yet, right? And so I think those are some of the tensions that I see playing out, and it's having an impact on everybody, like all the way up. And we also see what happens when the people at the top freak out, right? It's not pretty, and they can do a lot of damage.
So it's so interesting, Marco, that you're talking about this, because I think that part of what we've been attempting to do inside of the Tech We Want is, first of all, we're trying to build kind of a new kind of institution from the ground up. We talk a lot about building a multicultural institution and using that word multicultural to mean many, many different multiplicities, as opposed to trying to change an existing institution. We're trying to build something new. And also, we have also experienced some of the bumps and challenges that come from what I think fundamentally you're talking about, which is different capacities to wield power, experience and understanding and knowledge about what it means to hold power, what it means to share power, what it means to wield power. So I'd love for us to hear a little bit from Jasmine, from Julia, from Coraline about some of what you've experienced inside of our efforts, inside of our project, the Tech We Want, to attempt to center the margins, and some of both the light side and the shadow side of what it has meant to try to experiment and be with each other in a different kind of way that's attempting to center ethics and to center responsible innovation and to wield power and share power in different kinds of ways.
I'll say that the community that we have with the Tech We Want, I think we have the right aspirations, and I think we have the right people involved. But we have to recognize that, yes, we're going to make mistakes because we are a microcosm of the external world. The difference is we are not part of the Tech We Want because that's our day job. It's not putting food on our tables necessarily. The power dynamics are different. But also the fact that we are a consensual community means that we are extending a certain amount of grace to each other, and that we have a graceful exit if we find that the tensions are too high, if we are tired of microaggressions, even from the most well-meaning people. We have an exit that is relatively conflict-free. So I think that actually makes our community the perfect community for trying to address some of these problems, because we are experiencing them firsthand. We're experiencing them while we're in consensual relationship with each other, which I think is the best and most ethical way, honestly, to figure these.
Yeah, that idea of consent, I think, is something that we've tried really hard to foreground and to enable as a primary tool to enable us to be in the complicated sort of figuring it out together. Jasmine, I'd love for you to reflect on any of the experiences that you had in some of our gatherings as we were sort of starting to try to coalesce this community and exploring what does it mean to think about sharing power and to think about building together in that way.
Yeah, I think Caroline put a lot of the things very well. I think there is always negotiation. I think that the principle of, because we know that we're all here with the same aspiration, I think that provides a lot more grace, I think, for negotiating with each other, calling in instead of calling out. And so I think, and also we've had amazing facilitators, so I think that's helped us navigate instances where there have been conflict or differences of values, because I do think there is an inherent tension between, on one hand, this proposed idea around, say, a universal code of ethics, and on the other hand, having a multicultural community, institution, society, right? And that's why it's challenging. It's because I think ANIA with the Tech We Want has made this very conscious effort to bring in folks from a wide range of perspectives and backgrounds who actually do have many shared goals, but also small differences on the margins. And so I think it's actually been really productive and valuable to figure that out. One thing that I will also say that I feel like I've really learned from the group, and that I think that the other luminaries have done really well, and Coraline even sort of brought this up in her answer, is I feel like in terms of centering the margins, even those of us who are part of that group, we may be more diverse than the standard tech circle, but we also are leaders of organizations who are relatively well-resourced or connected or a bit further along in that journey. And I think a question that a lot of folks constantly ask ourselves is, who is not in the room right now, and how can we bring them in? And how do we ensure that when the Tech We Want works on projects like this timeline project that we're working on, it's not just a static thing where like the 10 or 15 of us decide this is the ultimate history of technology. Like, we know what's best. I think there's this openness towards, no, we also have to be putting stuff out into the world, letting other people critique us and incorporating that, and never feeling like that job is quite finished. So I think that's an approach that the Tech We Want has taken that I feel really inspired by.
Yeah, so this idea of there's consent, but also there's a sense that like it's never just us.
Yeah.
We are not the end of the road. We've now centered the margins. Ta-da, we've done it.
Like,
right?
we're the margins. It's us now. We know the rules.
Yeah, but now we're the center. So who else is in the margins? Julia, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit from your own experience of sort of being in the core team in the center of the project all the way from the beginning, around this question of how even in our core team, we've kind of wrestled with and juggled this idea of continuing to center that, to navigate the tensions between having a sort of a code of ethics or a set of shared values, but also having a multicultural community that's full of difference and full of diversity. And some of the conversations and experiences we've had of really understanding that to center the margins, to share power, all of us have to learn how to be leaders that are able to work across difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been such a beautiful journey and also really challenging in certain ways. I think bringing so many well-intentioned and very talented people in one room together is really beautiful and inspiring. And then you have moments of like, oh, people have different experiences. There's some folks who are more action-oriented and other folks who need to build a lot more trust. Some folks who've known other people in the group for a really long time. Other folks who are meeting others for the first time. Generational differences, cultural differences. And even though there is a vague North Star of where we want to go to, how to get there is really different because we all also reach for different tools. So one thing I really appreciated with this group is really this idea of like creating a sandbox, and like this idea of learning in public and having the willingness and compassion with ourselves and each other to make mistakes at times, knowing that mistakes are inevitable. They're definitely going to happen. So instead of looking at them with shame, what does it mean to have a conversation about it, to have it in the open, to take that down and metabolize that information back into the group. So I've really appreciated, your facilitation and Carla's facilitation as well in this group. There's been so much careful shepherding, as well as moments of taking a step back. And I think that's been a core tension as well of like, how do we, as organizers of this group, how do we give back power? And knowing that sometimes there are moments to shepherd and sometimes there are moments where folks need to kind of be in the middle of it and sit in the messiness of it. So overall, it's been really beautiful, I think, to learn those things together. And I'm really excited to see how we will continue to share those lessons that we're learning with the broader world.
Thanks, Julia. Everyone, I'm so thrilled that we could have been here together in this conversation. And I think what I'm taking away is that while there's still a huge way to go in terms of shifting what we understand at a mainstream level of what is ethical leadership, I think what I'm hearing is that in the communities that you're connected to, there are many, many folks who are very interested in this, who want to know more, who are learning more, who are finding the ways to put the right tools together, the right analysis together, and to be able to move forward in understanding how to negotiate and navigate being an ethical technologist in the industry as it is continuing to shift. And it's such a joy to be able to have you here to reflect on this together. And I think that this right here is a group of incredibly ethical leaders in the context of this industry. So I'm so grateful for each of you for being with us today, and also for all the work that you do in the world. So thank you everyone so much, and thanks for being with us. If you want to check out any more of our conversations for the Tech We Want, you can check us out on all of the social platforms. You can see any of our other future conversations. And thank you so much for hanging out with us today and being with us. Have a great one.